this is Ashley Jamerson coming to you from Charlotte, North Carolina. If you are watching this video, you are watching it for one of two reasons. One, you stumbled across it because you wanted some more information regarding the North Carolina offer to purchase. Or two, I sent you a link to this video because you are about to sign your offer to purchase your new home. This is a very long and in-depth video. I do suggest that you get something to drink, something to snack on. It's about an hour long. Definitely have a copy of your offer to purchase handy, and if you watch this video, you read over your offer and you still have questions, please do not hesitate to email, call, or text me. I look forward to talking to you soon, and congratulations on the decision to get this far and making an offer on your home. Talk to you soon. Bye. So let's understand what we're signing when it comes to the offer to purchase. On page 1, section 1, we start with the terms and definitions. Here we will see the seller and the buyer names, and we will also see information regarding the property itself, including the street, city, county, zip, things like that, and then the legal description and the property ID number, as well as where this original deed has been recorded. Now as we move down the page, let's start talking about the purchase price. Line 1 under D is the paid in US dollars upon the following terms. That very first line is where your bid or where your offer is going to be located. So let's say that the house is $200,000. $200,000 will go on that top line if that is your offer. The next line is by due diligence fee made payable and delivered to seller by the effective date. I can't say usually it's this or usually it's that, but with the offer to purchase in front of you, you will see a number that we have decided is a strong due diligence fee located here. For this example, let's use $1,000. So we'll say $1,000 due diligence fee made payable to the seller. Due diligence is a non-refundable fee. So whatever number you put there, it is basically gone if you decide to walk away from this property for any or no reason. And we'll discuss that in more detail later. But the due diligence fee on the seller side is typically what the seller would be paying for their mortgage. So again, let's just say $1,000, round it down to the nearest thousand, and we'll just rock with that. And then we get into the initial earnest money deposit. The earnest money is refundable. So if you do decide to walk away from this contract, you will receive your earnest money deposit back. This earnest money deposit is made out to the escrow agent, which in most cases working with me is going to be my attorney. It could be cash, personal check, official bank check, wire transfer, electronic transfer, or any other form of money that is accepted by the escrow agent. Usually a personal check will do, unless the seller specifies that they want hard funds in the form of an official bank check. But a personal check will do. Again, due diligence money is non-refundable. It's a check made out directly to the seller. There are some, things that will change that, but typically it's non-refundable. And then the initial earnest money is refundable. There are some options where there will be additional earnest money and other fees that are mentioned here, but typically the only things that I utilize with my typical buyers are the first 3 lines, which is your offer to purchase, due diligence fee, and initial earnest money fee. So we are working with that $200,000 house. Let's say we do $1,000 for due diligence, and we do $1,000 for your earnest money deposit. On the very last line, you will see balance of the purchase price in cash at settlement. This will then be $200,000 minus $1,000 minus another $1,000 will get you to $198. So that will be the amount that you will actually be getting your loan on. So the initial earnest money and the due diligence money will be like credits at closing. So your balance or your new loan will be based off the $198. There are some initial lines down here. You have to initial every page in a real estate contract just to make sure that the agent went over it with you and that you understand all the verbiage on each line. Now that we are on page 2, let's start with section E, which discusses the earnest money deposit. As I mentioned before, the earnest money deposit is refundable. It is held in an escrow account by the escrow agent. Like I mentioned, it is my attorney, and this earnest money just stays there until closing. In the event that you do not close, the escrow agent / attorney will not just hand over the money to the buyer, but there has to be a form that is signed that releases the earnest money in a way that is agreed upon by the buyer and seller. And the reason why it has to be agreed upon is because this is a contract, and even though the attorney works on behalf of the buyer, they have to make sure that the buyer is not trying to pull a slick one on the seller. So it stays in that escrow account until closing or until it is decided on how it's going to be released. In the event that you go past the due diligence period, which we will discuss shortly, then this earnest money will be released to the seller as liquidated damages. That means that the seller can't get mad and sue you for more money. The due diligence money and the earnest money is as far as the suation will go. So that is the liquidated damages that the seller will receive in the event that you do not close. Section F is where the escrow agent will be entered. Again, usually the escrow agent is my attorney. However, sometimes if it's a short sale or foreclosure, then the seller will specify who they want to hold the money. My company, Ashley Lambert Realty, never holds earnest money in an escrow account. I make sure that the attorney handles it. So let's continue on with section G, which discusses the effective date of the contract. The effective date of the contract is when both parties have agreed to everything in the contract. It has been signed, sealed, and delivered to the buyer. Everything has been initialed. You are no longer countering back and forth on this contract. So that effective date is when everything begins and the real estate clock starts ticking officially. Section H talks about due diligence, and this is the buyer's opportunity to fully investigate the property. You're not just making sure that the house appraises or there's nothing wrong with the house in the inspection, but you're also going to be doing a drive-by by the property to make sure that you're okay with how the property looks on the weekend and you're okay with just the property as a whole. You need to fall in love with this property. Section I discusses the due diligence fee. It goes into detail about how the due diligence fee is a non-refundable fee paid to the seller. The only way you would ever get the due diligence money back is in the event of a material breach of this contract by the seller, or basically the seller rolls over and they say, I don't want to sell this property any longer. If that happens, the buyer, you in the situation, would receive the earnest money, the due diligence money, and any other fees you had to pay during the inspection of the property. So you're going to get your appraisal back, you're going to get your inspection back, and any other things that you had to endure during the due diligence process. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but it does happen, unfortunately. Every now and then a seller will decide they do not want to sell their house. Section J talks about the due diligence period. Whatever date is listed here is the very last day you have to inspect the property. So you have until 5 p.m. on this date to decide whether or not you want to move forward with this contract. After this period, the earnest money that you gave to the escrow agent becomes solid, becomes rock hard, becomes non-refundable. So up until this point, for any or no reason at all, you can say, Ashley, I do not want to buy this property, and then I would do the paperwork to withdraw your offer, and you would get your earnest money only back. You have until 5 p.m., but please do not wait until 4:50 to let me know this information, because I have to get the documents over to the seller by 5 p.m., not 5:05 or 5:10. And every now and then you'll run into an agent who is a true stickler for that 5 p.m. and we don't want to put your earnest money and due diligence money in limbo. If we can get some money back, let's at least get your earnest money back. K is talking about settlement, and this is when the contract is ready to close and you are ready to take possession of your home. So the settlement date mentioned in letter L is when all parties will meet, you will sign your documents, you will hand over keys, and you will be a happy homeowner. So this is the end of page 2, and this is where you would initial, where it says buyer initials. Looking on page 3, let's start discussing the closing. The closing is basically, like I mentioned before, it's when all things are settled. The seller receives their compensation for the sale of the house. The deed is recorded. Everyone meets. Funds are received by everyone. You pay your closing costs, things like that. And your deed is actually recorded and you are a happy homeowner. That's just what closing is. It's when everything is finalized. And goes over some special assessments, proposed special assessments, and confirmed special assessments. You usually run into the assessment issue when there is a neighborhood of condos or townhouses or just a regular neighborhood with an HOA. Every now and then an HOA wants to make an improvement to the neighborhood and they will divide that cost up between all the homeowners. Sometimes when there's a townhouse or a condo, they need to do something special to a specific building and it's outside of the range of their budget, and they add an assessment to a property that will increase the HOA. And if that happens and you buy a house that has an assessment, that becomes your responsibility. So we really like for the seller to let us know when this happens. Sometimes it could be a proposed assessment when they're just talking about it, but it's not been approved. They have to disclose that because basically that's a material fact that will affect the affordability of the home for you in the future. And then there's the confirmed special assessment when it's actually confirmed and when the attorney calls the HOA to make sure that they have all the costs of the HOA and the transfer fees. They'll also ask about the assessment and they'll get that final information as well. Section 2 of this contract on page 3 discusses fixtures and exclusions. One thing to remember is that anything that is attached to the property is a part of the property, and a lot of sellers get that mixed up, especially now that we are hanging our flat screens on the above the fireplace or just on the wall, and we're getting solar energy systems and things like that. They don't realize that that is actually becoming a permanent fixture to the property. So section A, we would want the seller to specify what items are leased and not owned but are screwed or attached to the property. This includes fuel tanks, antennas, satellite dishes, receivers, appliances that are not owned yet, like outright owned. They still have a bill on those on those appliances, and any alarm and security system equipment that they have to return. Possibly they're renting it and they didn't buy it flat out. So that will be listed by the seller in section A, and that will be added during the offer counter offer period, or it'll be mentioned in the MLS, and I will add it in there for the sellers to confirm before they sign. Section B goes over a very in-depth list of things that are often overlooked but are in fact permanent fixtures to the properties. Things include the range, stove, oven, built-in appliances, light fixtures. Even that beautiful antique chandelier is a fixture unless it is specified in section D that it does not convey. If there are any items in section D that are not going to convey with the purchase of the property, then what I do is I will ask them to remove it, of course, prior to the final walkthrough before closing. And if it's something like a a flat screen bracket, which is a permanent fixture and should convey, but if they want to take it with them, they need to make sure that they remove it in a professional manner. They fill the holes, they repaint, they make it look basically brand new. So definitely take a second to look over B. If there was anything in the property that you want to like double check to make sure that the seller is going to leave it, let me know. Every now and then, bookshelves that are attached to the wall will still be there at closing, and the buyer will say, why didn't they take that with them? And it's because it was attached by like an anti-tip bracket or something like that, and they left it there. So that takes care of B. C and D, again, D is where the seller will put items that do not convey, items that they will be taking with them, such as that antique chandelier, before closing, that they just want to take it with them. Section 3 goes over personal property, and these are things that will be transferred to the buyer at no value at closing. So things that I would put on this line is a refrigerator, a refrigerator, stove, microwave, dishwasher, things like that. Every now and then I'll have a buyer ask me for like outdoor grilling equipment, outdoor furniture, but again, that is added to the contract at no additional cost to the buyer. It's just an added perk. They can say no. I've had people fall in love with their refrigerator and not want to leave it, and that's their prerogative because it is not attached by a bracket to the property. It is removable without damaging or altering the structure. So if you understand everything on page 3, you would initial this section as well. Now we have gotten to page 4, section 4, with the buyer's due diligence process. Part A discusses the loan, and during the due diligence period, we are making sure that you are still approved for the loan. You're going through all the final approval process with the lender. They are verifying your income, verifying your assets, and just making sure that your loan is being approved. So that's on the lender side. On our side, we are doing our inspections, reviewing documentation. I put you in touch with my preferred insurance provider, or you have contacted your own. The appraisal has been ordered and has been performed, and a survey if you want a survey done. You are checking out zoning and government regulations, flood hazard, and also access to the utilities. That section, when it comes to access to utilities, it's like a huge issue when there's like a well or septic on the property, but usually it's city water, city sewer, so you don't really have to worry about that too much. But again, this specifies just a few of the many items that you're going to be taking care of during this due diligence process. If you remember on page 2, during the due diligence, it was saying that you have until a specific date. So usually that date is about 2 weeks out from the effective date on the contract. So 2 weeks to get this done. Seems like a lot, but it's totally doable. So it's nothing to stress out about. As soon as you go under contract, the lender will order the appraisal. As soon as you go under contract, I will order the inspections, and I will start reviewing and asking for the restrictive covenants on the property if I have not received those already. And I will also put you in contact with the insurance provider, and it only takes them about 15-20 minutes to get the information needed for the insurance quote, and then they will give you quotes and let you decide on affordability and how much you want to pay for your insurance. So that is this section. Section 9 and 10 discusses some more items that are part of the buyer's due diligence process. Section 9 are the streets and roads. Most streets and roads are going to be handled or maintained by the county or the city, but every now and then you will have a private street or road, and in that situation we would have to review and make sure we are okay with the maintenance agreement that those neighbors who share that road have created. A road maintenance agreement is something that is created. Let's say there's this road in the middle of the country and a tree falls, blocking entrance to those houses, and like no one can get home. It says who is responsible and how they split the cost of removing the tree and repairing anything that was damaged. Section 10 is the fuel tank. You want to inspect the existing fuel tank and decide how the existing fuel will be handled. Usually, you'll get a read on how much gas is in that tank, and then you would pay the seller for the amount of gas in the tank unless they just want to give it to you. So you do want to inspect that fuel tank to make sure it's working properly and it's up to code. Section C is very, very important, and you'll see in bold it says the property is being sold in its current condition. A lot of buyers do not know that every property on the market is sold as is. When you were searching for property, you would see some sellers' agents specify sold as is. It's a waste of ink. It's a waste of characters in the MLS because every property is sold as is. During the due diligence process and during the inspections, you do have a list of things you would like the seller to fix, but those are requests made by the made by the buyer to the seller. The seller can say yes, no, or maybe. And because all this is done during the due diligence process, if they say no, then you have the right to walk away, forfeiting your forfeiting your due diligence money and negotiating the release of the earnest money. So every house is sold as is, and they don't have to repair anything. I ran into an agent this year who basically asked me if it's working and if it is it performing its function, and the answer was yes, but it's old and it could break at any time, and they refused to fix the item. So there are ways to remediate this issue with a home warranty, but that will cover you for a year, and then after that year there's an additional cost. So again, every house is sold as is, and that's something that you should definitely keep in the back of your mind. Like, if they say no, are you comfortable with this property? Section D is buyer's obligation to repair damage. If you or I or our inspector or appraisal or somebody is in the house and messes something up, then we are responsible for fixing it or making sure that the inspector or appraiser or someone fixes it back to the way it was. So that's, if you break it, you buy it, sort of kind of there. But you definitely want to make sure that if anything is damaged and you don't move forward with the purchase of the property, that it's fixed. So this is the end of page 4. If you would go ahead and initial that, we can move on to page 5. Now let's get started with page 5 with section F. This is the fun part where the buyer has the right to terminate. You have the right to terminate this contract without making anyone mad because you are buying a house and not a pair of shoes, but you can terminate this contract for any reason or no reason at all. If you just decide you don't like the house on the left side of the road, you'd rather have a house on the right side of the road, you can, cancel this contract. If you speak with the lender and the interest rate was locked in at a little bit higher than you were expecting, making the affordability of the home a little bit higher than you feel comfortable with, then you can cancel this contract. If anything popped up in the inspection or the seller said they were not going to negotiate repairs with you to your liking, you can cancel this contract. But keep in mind that time is of the essence. You have until that date mentioned on page 2 to back out. You have until 5 o'clock, but again, please don't wait until 4:50 to tell me you want out, because I have to prepare the cancellation or the termination notice and then get it over to the seller in time. B, you will receive your earnest money only, and you will not receive your due diligence money. So F is very important. You do have a right to back out of the contract, but there are some consequences and, of course, some time lost. You will not receive the money that you spent on the inspection back, and you will not receive any money that you spent on the appraisal back. The seller is not obligated to grant you any extension to the due diligence period. However, we can always ask. So let's say that we are 2 days out from the expiration of your due diligence period, and you say, I need some more time, or the appraisal is not back, or you're waiting for some additional quotes on repairs for the house, then within reason, the seller will usually give us some type of extension to the due diligence period so you can further inspect the property. But they're not obligated to do that. They, of course, want to sell the house, so more than likely they will grant you that extension. But an extension really isn't in their benefit, so they do have the right to say no. In real estate, everything has to be in writing, so if you want an extension, I have to get the document signed by you and over to the seller to request that extension. Section G is all caps and all bold because it's very important. It says when you take acceptance, or when you close on this property, you are accepting the property in its current condition. This is why a final walkthrough is so important. I have had situations where there has been a beautiful rug in the living room, and that beautiful rug was covering up a huge stain. And we did not discover that stain until the final walkthrough. So once you get to closing and you sign on the documents, you can't go back and say, hey, I had no idea there was a huge stain on the wood floor. That's like a big deal. I am known for walking through the house during inspection and pulling back rugs just to make sure there isn't anything hidden underneath. But if something like that does happen, even though we are out of the due diligence period, because again, we're at closing, or a day before closing or 2 days before closing at the final walkthrough, we can at least bring it to the seller's attention that we know and see if they'll work with us on getting it repaired. And of course, they knew that the stain was there because they covered it with that pretty rug, and they didn't disclose that to us. So there could be something that we could work out to benefit the buyer and the seller and to keep the closing date. But once you sign all the documents, you take ownership of the property and everything that is great and wrong with the property. Now we are getting to section 5 of the contract. This is the buyer representations. This is where you will disclose that you will or will not be getting a loan on the property. And if you are getting a loan on the property, what type of loan you are going to be applying for. This is important information for the seller to know because if your offer is great, but it's a financed offer up against a cash offer, then the cash offer would probably have a little bit more strength. And if you are an FHA buyer up against a conventional buyer, then the conventional offer may have a little bit more strength. So they really want to know what type of loan you will be getting. Other situations is that the FHA and VA appraisals and inspections are a little bit more strict on the condition of the home in comparison to a cash, obviously, and a conventional. So if the house needs a little bit more work, it may not even approve for an FHA or VA loan and will only approve for a cash conventional or an FHA 203K, which is a repair loan. So you do have to disclose that just so the seller can make an educated decision about what offer they will accept and to make sure that their home will actually meet the requirements of your loan type that you are applying for. Section B talks about other properties that you may own or currently lease, and is asking, do you have to sell or lease a property that you currently own? That's called a contingency, and a contingency basically weakens your offer a little bit, because it's saying that I have to sell or lease my property before I can buy your property. And if I can't sell or lease my property, then I cannot successfully buy your property. So again, it's giving the information to the seller so they can make an educated decision on whether or not to accept your offer over another offer or just in general. Section C talks about performance of buyer's financial obligations. Once you go under contract, obviously you're already pre-qualified, or I wouldn't have showed you the property, and we wouldn't have gotten this far of having an offer drafted. But the lender is going to ask you for documents, and you're going to get to the point where you're probably going to be a little bit sick of sending in documents. But those documents are to verify your income, verify your assets and your identity, and any type of weird irregularities that may have popped up on your file. They want explanations of those. So Section C is saying that you are going to work hard to get all that information to the lender. Okay? Get everything done. Section D talks about the residential property disclosure. Usually before we get to the offer process, I would have already received the property disclosure from the seller's agent, and I would have checked the first box and saying that you received it, and you're okay with it, and you've signed it, and it's attached to this offer. If you have not received the disclosure, then they have, I think it's 2 days. No, they have 3 days. The seller has 3 days to get you that residential property disclosure for you to look over and make sure that you're comfortable with it. The third checkbox is an exemption from the property disclosure, and that's checked if the property is a foreclosure, because the bank never actually stepped foot in the property. They don't know about the conditions. There's nothing to disclose on their end from their point of view. When you purchase a home in North Carolina, you're not just purchasing the front yard, the backyard, and the house itself. You are also purchasing all the air above your home and all of the dirt and minerals and gas below your home. So it is very important that the seller discloses if they have severed the rights to the mineral and gas in the ground to another company or another entity. So again, usually I received a copy of this disclosure, and I will check the first box. If I haven't received it, I have 3 days to receive it and get it to you, and check the second box. And if this is a foreclosed property, you are praying that they didn't sever it before they foreclosed on the property, and we would check the third box because there wouldn't be any record of that, of whatever the previous owner did. Section 6 is the buyer's obligations. A is the responsibility for proposed special assessments. We briefly discussed proposed special assessments earlier, but if they know about a proposed special assessment, that is material fact. They have to let us know so we can make an educated decision on, again, the affordability of the property. Section B talks about the responsibility for certain costs. When it comes to the buyer, you are responsible for all of the costs associated with the appraisal and the inspections, the title search, the title insurance, recording of the deed, and so on. So there's a list of the responsibilities that you have when it comes to purchasing the property. Seems like a long list, but a lot of it is like nitpicky and included with the attorney's fees at closing. Getting into Section C, we need to start talking about the authorization to disclose information. This should be in bold, in my opinion, for HOA companies, because sometimes they don't want to release information. But this is basically authorizing that the buyer's lender, attorney, and everyone works together, and that we release and request and we get the information that we need in order to make a smooth transaction. There really isn't a time where the attorney needs to know how much money you make and things like that, but they will need to get like a packet from the lender, and the lender has to release the packet to the attorney so they can prepare all of the closing documents that are assigned at closing. And the HOA has to release information to the lender and the attorney when it comes to affordability and closing, to make sure all of the money that they need is collected. So basically it should be in bold, but again, it's there and it authorizes that information is requested and received in a timely manner. Section 7 talks about the seller representations. A is ownership, and this is important if you are getting an FHA loan. They usually like to see that it's been owned for at least a year, but this, basically lets us know how long the current seller has owned the property. If this is left blank, I can find this information out very easily with the tax records. Section B is if this property was built prior to 1978, there is a huge chance that there is lead-based paint in the property. If there is lead-based paint in the property, I have to give you a disclosure, and we have to discuss on how you would like to have it fixed, if you want it fixed at all. But at least that information is disclosed and you are aware that the house is built prior to 1978, and you'll have all the information you need to make an educated decision on moving forward with the property. Section C, again, we're talking about seller representations. So this is where the seller will let us know if there are any assessments on the property. If you see an NA, which means not applicable, that's wrong, and don't sign it. It should say none, and that none should be added by the seller because they need to know that they are representing that there are no assessments on this property. If none is already on these two lines, then by them signing this offer and this contract is them acknowledging and saying that there are no proposed assessments. Section D is about the homeowners associations and dues, and this is basically authorizing the HOA to talk to us and to give us the information that we request. So if you understand everything on page 6, go ahead and initial. We are starting off page 7 with a list of things that the HOA should release to the buyer or to the attorney upon request. It's including the statements of the accounts, the rules and regulations, the articles of incorporation, basically anything that regulates what you can and cannot do within the neighborhood. The next little area with the specified name of the association, this is going to let us know how much the association is, how often you pay it, and who the attorney is to contact to get all the information that's mentioned in the list above. So it's pretty self-explanatory, but this is where the seller will acknowledge or will write down who the HOA is. Now we're going to get into Section 8, which is the seller obligations. Section 8A is evidence of title and payoff of statements. When you take possession of this property, you want to make sure there are no liens on the property and everything has been paid and there's no clouds on the title and things like that. So they want to make sure that it's the seller's obligation to make sure that they give all the information to the attorney so they can investigate the deed and title and look for liens and make sure everything is completely taken care of by the seller at closing prior to you signing your purchase documents at closing. Section B is the authorization to disclose information. So the attorney, even though the attorney is working on behalf of the buyer, the seller must disclose certain information to the attorney so that they can successfully prepare all the documents for closing. Section C is the access to property, the walkthrough inspection. So whenever you're under contract, the seller can't just say, oh, you're under contract, see you at closing. They have to give you access to the property to perform your inspections. And this is, within reason. You can't call and say, I'll be there in 30 minutes. But you would make an appointment for the inspection, for the appraisal, and any walkthroughs of the property. Even something as small as measuring to make sure that your bed will fit, that your refrigerator will fit, things like that. They have to allow you to do that. Preferably things like measuring is done during the due diligence period. So if something does not fit that you are in love with, like an antique chandelier, then you will have that right to back out of the property. But that final walkthrough, again, is super important, and they are legally obligated to make sure that they allow you to do that. Section 8D discusses the removal of the seller's property. Prior to closing, the seller has to remove all personal debris, including their garbage, from the property. This is very important because every now and then you will have a seller who leaves trash bags full of trash inside the house because the trash pickup date isn't for another few days after closing. But that's just not how things are supposed to go. They're supposed to remove all that stuff from the property, and the only way to confirm this is during the final walkthrough a few days prior to the closing. Section E is talking about repairs that are made by the seller or anything that has become a lien on the property caused by the seller. They want to make sure that everyone is paid at closing. So if the seller went and got this beautiful deck that you fell in love with, then the attorney will make sure that the contractor who installed the deck not only pulled the permits for that deck, but was also paid, because once you take possession of the house, you take possession of all liens. So it's very important that we just confirm that there's nothing left to be paid and everything's paid by the seller at closing. Section F, again, it's talking about money, and anything that's owed by the seller is paid for at closing, so you get a clear title and deed to the property. If you understand page 7, go ahead and initial at the bottom, and we'll move on to page 8. Section G talks about good title, legal access, and in bold you'll see general warranty deed. A general warranty deed is like the best deed you can have on a property. It means that it is free of everything that was mentioned in on page 7 in sections E and F. And it's just, you own the property, you have nothing to worry about. In some cases, especially when it comes to foreclosures, they will ask to mark out general warranty deed and put special warranty deed there. Of course, you'd have to initial any changes, but a special warranty deed is just saying that there may be something that could pop up in the future, like someone could knock on your door and say, hey, I never got paid for these windows. But it's not going to really mess up the ownership of the house per se. So it's sort of like buyer beware, but general warranty deed is the most common deed, and that's why it's a part of the contract. And it's the best. That's what you want. Section H is the deed taxes and fees. This is saying that the seller will pay for preparation of a deed and all other documents necessary for the closing. However, the deed is to be made out to, and that's going to be the buyer name. So that's going to be your name, will be listed there. Section I talks about the agreement to pay buyer expenses. This is the seller paid closing costs that we're probably like, you're like, we're on page 8. Why are we just now talking about closing costs? But it's one single line, and whatever amount you see there is the amount that we hopefully received from the lender, who said that this is your projected closing cost. Now, the closing costs are things like your prepaids, your taxes, insurance, your homeowner's insurance, your owner's association dues, things like that. Some lenders will specify what they will not allow the seller to pay at closing, but typically it'll be used up. We're not going to let it go to waste. And if the sellers, well, if your lender will not allow you to take the full amount that we actually received in the contract, then there's a way that we can adjust the contract to make sure that you do receive that money. But closing costs will be listed in section I. Section J is a continuation of the seller's obligations. with this contract, and this is talking about the owners association fees and charges. This is going to go over the seller shall pay all the fees that they are supposed to pay. So any charges, if they're behind, they have to pay that. It'll be covered at closing. Section K is any confirmed special assessments have to be paid for by the seller at closing. That's the seller's obligation because they were confirmed during the ownership of the seller. So they will be paying that. Any late listing penalties, all property tax late listing penalties will be paid for by the seller. Negotiated repairs and improvements have to be paid for by the seller and taken care of prior to closing. And one thing I want you to take a look at is shall be made in a good and workmanlike manner. This does not mean that a licensed general contractor or a licensed plumber or electrician has to do the work that you requested. If the seller feels like they can do the work in a workmanlike manner, then that's their prerogative to try. However, the way that I work is that I request a licensed contractor to perform the work, and then if it's something major, we will definitely do a reinspection to make sure that the work was done correctly. And I also request receipts. So if something falls apart within days or it was just like a little cover up, then we know who to call. We'll call that general contractor. Section N discusses the seller's failure to comply or breach. I think we discussed this earlier in the contract, but if the seller is in breach of contract, then they forfeit the earnest money, the due diligence money, and any other reasonable cost incurred by the buyer during the due diligence period. So that's your cost of inspections, appraisal, moving, like anything that you feel is a reasonable cost connected to the sale of the property, then that would just be breach of contract and money that they forfeit back to you. I often get asked what are the closing costs if they're paying their down payment. The down payment is something that the lender requires to get the loan, but the closing cost is things that are mentioned in Section 9 underneath prorations and adjustments. So you're going to be paying your prorated taxes on your real property, the prorated taxes on personal property, prorated rents, and dues. So let's say that you bought the property on the 10th of the month. The seller will pay the taxes from the 1st to the 10th, and then you'll pay taxes from the 11th moving on. If the seller received rent on the property, you're buying an investment property and there's a tenant in place, then the seller has earned the rent from the 1st to the 10th, and you'll receive a credit for the rent 11th moving on. Same thing with the dues of like the homeowners association. So that incorporated with things like the fees charged by the attorney to record is going to be part of your prorations and adjustments. So if you understand page 8, go ahead and initial where it says buyer initials. At the top of page 9, section 10, we talk about the home warranty. This discusses whether or not you will be receiving a home warranty at cost of the seller, and if the seller does agree to a home warranty, who will pay for it, and how much the seller agrees to pay of that home warranty. So section 10, the second option is the buyer is obtaining the home warranty and the seller agrees to pay a certain amount of it. And then section C is if the seller agrees to pay it, who is the home warranty company and how much it costs. Section 11 talks about the condition of the property at closing. The condition of the property has to be in the same condition or better condition as when the house went under contract. Section 12 is very funny to me because if the house burns down, it doesn't necessarily nullify the contract. The seller has to basically let the buyer know that the house is no longer standing, and the seller can either refund all of the money to the buyer, or the buyer could wait and have the seller rebuild the property with the proceeds from the insurance company. So most people, if the house burns down, they'll walk away, but every now and then you'll have a property in a highly sought after area, and it's worth waiting to rebuild or to take that insurance money and rebuild a property that you want there. Section 13 discusses the delay in settlement and closing. On page 2, we discussed the closing date, and if that closing date is not met, then the delaying party, it could be the buyer or the seller, they have 14 days to close it. And 14 days in real estate, we're about to go over that, is every single day. It's pregnant days, sick days, government, federal, local holidays, everything like that is a real estate day. So they have 14 days to close, and if they don't close, then the delaying party is in breach of contract, and we would again discuss the release of the earnest money, due diligence money, and all of the other fees that were paid for by the seller if they were the party that has been stressed out in this process, what money they can get back. In special circumstances, the buyer can take possession of the property prior to closing. In the event that that happens, of course, in real estate, everything has to be in writing. So a possession before closing agreement has to be attached to this property, and it has its own verbiage that has to be agreed upon by both parties. Section 15 talks about the addenda that are attached to this contract, if any. The most commonly used one is the FHA VA financing addendum for those buyers who are using an FHA or VA loan, the lead-based paint addendum for properties built after 1978, and then the contingent sale addendum. And that's if you have to sell or lease your current property before you buy this property, then that addenda will be attached to this property, to this contract. If there are any other attorney or party drafted addenda that has to be attached, and that last checkbox will be checked, and then the name of that addenda will be listed there, and it becomes a part of the contract. Section 16 begins conversation about assignments of the contract. Some investors will get under contract with a property, and then they will assign the contract to someone else. And in the event that that happens, the new assignee or the new person who has taken possession of the contract has to still meet all the requirements, and especially when it comes to the loan, if they have to get a loan, and meet all the requirements of the HOA. So if you understand page 9, go ahead and initial at the bottom. Section 17 discusses the tax-deferred exchange. If you are initiating the tax-deferred exchange or it's benefiting you, then you would have to pay for any costs associated with the tax-deferred exchange. Section 18, the parties of this contract are the buyer and seller listed on page 1. If one of those parties were to pass away, then it doesn't necessarily mean that the contract is null and void. For instance, if the buyer or buyers pass away, then there's no one to buy the house, and the heirs are not forced to purchase the property from the seller. But in the event that the seller or one of the sellers pass away, then the respective heirs or successors are required to move forward with the sale of the property. In the event that the seller passes away, it could take a little bit longer to sell the property because there would be more people involved, obviously, and also the estate attorney or the person handling the last affairs of the sellers could take a little bit longer to get all of their documents in order. Section 20 says that you are accepting this agreement in its entirety. Nothing is marked out without being initialed by the other party, and all the addenda attached to the property are listed on the previous page. Section 21, the conduct of this transaction. This is saying that we can do this transaction electronically. We do not have to meet and have wet signatures. We can use email, we can use fax, and things like that, as long as we are communicating with the correct people. Now we are basically at the end of the contract, and section 22 is the execution. Execution of the contract is when all parties have signed everything and it has been communicated to everyone. So once you submit this offer and the seller signs it, it becomes a fully executed contract once I receive it back on your behalf. Section 23 discusses the computation of days and the time of day. In North Carolina, a real estate day is every single day. It includes Saturdays, Sundays, holidays, sick days, pregnant days, federal, state, local, and religious holidays as well. So if an important date, such as a due diligence period, falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday, or you happen to be sick and I can't reach you, then that still counts as a real estate day. So definitely keep that in mind. If you understand page 10, please initial where it says buyer initials, and we'll go on to page 11. On page 11 is where all the parties will sign. If you are a buyer, you will be signing, of course, on the buyer side, and sellers will be signing on the seller side. If you are a company, an LLC, corporation, partnership, or trust, you will be signing where it says entity buyer. Page 12 is where the notice information is recorded. Typically, you will only see the selling agent notice address information and the listing agent notice address information. The selling agent is myself, so you will see my firm name, my firm license, my mailing address, my information, including my license number, my phone number, and my contact information. And you will see the same information for the listing agent on page 12. There's nowhere for you to sign here. The lender may ask for a copy of this page. This is page 13, and it is the acknowledgement of receipt of monies. Here you will see the seller name at the top, the buyer name at the top, as well as the property address. And then any money that has exchanged hands will be listed and signed off here, so there is a paper trail. So when the listing agent receives the due diligence money on behalf of the seller, that listing agent will sign the first section. When the seller acknowledges receipt of the due diligence money from the seller's agent, there's a place to sign. And when the escrow agent, in our case would be the attorney, receives the earnest money, they will sign, and then a copy of this will be sent to the lender for their records, showing that you paid the money that was mentioned on page 1. So we are done with the offer to purchase and contract. Once you sign and initial all the places that need to be signed and initialed, I will submit this over to the seller. If the seller accepts this offer in its entirety, it becomes a contract. In the event that they do not accept the offer and they make some changes to the offer, it becomes a counter offer, and you can accept those changes or not. But the goal is to make it a contract and to find some common ground. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, let me know, but do not sign this document until you fully understand it in its entirety. Talk to you soon. Bye.